On a calm Thursday night in October 1978, NBC Studio One in Burbank felt exactly the way it always did when The Tonight Show went live. Bright lights flooded the stage, cameras rolled smoothly into position, and a studio audience of nearly 300 people buzzed with excitement. For millions of Americans watching from their living rooms, Johnny Carson wasn't just a television host, he was part of their nightly routine, a familiar presence who made the world feel lighter before bedtime. At precisely 11:30 p.m. Eastern, Johnny stepped forward and began his monologue, delivering sharp jokes about politics, gas prices, and disco culture with the effortless confidence that had made him the king of late night. Laughter filled the studio, Ed McMahon's booming voice echoed from his desk, and Doc Severinsen sat proudly in one of his trademark flashy jackets, waiting to cue the orchestra. Everything was perfect. Everything was normal. No one, not the producers, not the audience, not the viewers at home, could have imagined that within minutes, this carefully controlled television machine would come to a complete emotional halt. In the front row sat a small blonde girl named Emma Richardson, just 5 years old, wearing a bright yellow sundress decorated with tiny white flowers. She clutched a faded black and white photograph so tightly that the edges had begun to bend. It was her first time inside a television studio, and the magic around her felt overwhelming, the lights, the laughter, the applause. But Emma wasn't there for entertainment. She wasn't hoping to wave at the camera or see a famous person up close. She was there because her father, Thomas Richardson, had placed an enormous responsibility on her small shoulders. Thomas sat beside her, a former Navy medic whose body carried scars from Vietnam and whose heart carried something even heavier, guilt that had followed him for 10 long years. The photograph Emma held showed 2 young men in Navy uniforms, smiling with their arms around each other as if nothing in the world could ever touch them. One of those men was Thomas. The other was a man named Michael Carson. The show continued smoothly as Johnny transitioned toward his desk, adjusting his tie and preparing to introduce his first guest. Emma leaned toward her father and whispered a question she had already asked several times that evening. "Daddy, when do I tell him?" Thomas swallowed hard, his eyes never leaving the stage. He didn't answer right away because he didn't know how to explain timing to a child when he himself had waited a decade for the courage to speak. Finally, in a breaking voice, he said, "When it feels right, sweetheart. Mr. Carson needs to know." Those words carried years of buried pain. Thomas had lived every day knowing he survived something another man did not. He had lived knowing that the man who died saving his life was the younger brother of the most famous television host in America. And he had lived knowing that Johnny Carson had never once spoken that brother's name in public. As Johnny finished a joke that sent the audience into another wave of laughter, Emma made a decision only a child could make, simple, fearless, and absolute. She stood up on her chair. Before her father could stop her, she climbed over the seat and began running down the aisle toward the stage. Gasps rippled through the studio as people realized something was wrong. This was live television. There were rules. There were barriers. NBC security immediately moved forward, confused and unprepared for a 5-year-old with such determination. Emma's small shoes pounded against the floor as she shouted Johnny Carson's name with all the urgency she could summon. The orchestra's transition music faltered. The laughter faded. And when Emma yelled, "Mr. Carson, you need to know the truth," time seemed to stop. Johnny froze mid-motion, his hand hovering over his coffee mug. His smile disappeared instantly. When Emma shouted the name Michael, something in Johnny visibly collapsed. Ed McMahon stood up from his desk, sensing this was no joke. Doc Severinsen raised his hand, and the orchestra went silent. 15 million people watching at home leaned forward, instinctively aware that they were witnessing something unscripted, raw, and irreversible. Johnny lifted his hand and told security to stop. "Let her come up here," he said quietly, his voice already trembling. A stagehand helped Emma onto the stage, where she stood under the lights, tiny and vulnerable, holding a photograph that weighed more than the entire studio combined. Johnny knelt down to her level, trying to speak gently, but his voice betrayed him. He asked her name. He asked her age. And when he asked about Michael, his hands began to shake uncontrollably. Emma explained, just as her father had practiced with her, that Michael Carson was Johnny's younger brother, a Navy medic who served in Vietnam. She told him how Michael had saved 14 men during combat, how he had shielded her father during a mortar attack, and how he had died so another man could live. The audience wept openly. Johnny's composure vanished entirely as the guilt he had carried for years surfaced in front of the nation. Emma then delivered the message Thomas had waited 10 years to pass on, that Michael's final words were never about blame, only forgiveness. He wanted Johnny to keep making people laugh. He wanted his brother to live without guilt. Johnny Carson collapsed onto the stage, sobbing uncontrollably. Ed McMahon rushed to his side. The cameras kept rolling. There was no escape from the truth now. When Thomas Richardson was brought onto the stage, the two men faced each other not as celebrities or veterans, but as brothers bound by loss. They embraced, and America watched something rare, a moment so human it transcended television. Johnny finished the show without guests, without comedy, without artifice. He spoke honestly about grief, about silence, about forgiveness arriving late but still arriving. The next morning, newspapers across the country carried the story. Letters poured in. Calls flooded NBC. People shared their own hidden griefs, inspired by one brave child who refused to let silence win. That night changed lives. Johnny quietly funded Emma's education. He created a scholarship in his brother's name. And for the rest of his life, he carried not guilt, but remembrance. Emma grew up knowing she had delivered one of the most powerful messages ever spoken on live television. And decades later, that story remains a reminder that sometimes healing doesn't come from professionals, speeches, or time, but from a small voice brave enough to speak the truth when no one else can.